Hi everyone, I'm here today with Dr. Carol Anne Wien. Carol Anne has been tremendously important in the Canadian early childhood field over many years and is recognized for her teaching and writing, prolific writing about emergent curriculum, the practices of Reggio Emilia, reflective practices, pedagogical documentation, amongst other things. And today, Carol Anne and I are going to be talking about pedagogical documentation, something which we've discussed a lot of times for many hours over the years. And so that's our topic. So welcome, Carol Anne. Thanks for being here. Let's start with your own first exposure to pedagogical documentation. When and where did that happen? And do you remember what was your first response when you first were exposed to this kind of documentation?
Well, the first awareness I had of, our society records everything all the time. We document register slips, medical records, photo albums. Documentation as recording something is very, very common. But the idea of it as a route through which you might think about children's thinking or learning or the teacher's learning, etc., thinking of it in a way that goes way beyond a recording, I think that actually it occurred for me during my doctoral program, because in anthropology and ethnology, think of Margaret Mead back in the 19th taking 32 rolls of film a day and developing it all night. And then out of that, she would build her theories of how a culture worked. So it's been in our Western intellectual tradition for a long, long time. But it was probably the documentation of the Reggio Emilia exhibits where I first saw it directed to the work of very young children and their thinking, right? And it made me want to try it. When I first saw it, I thought it was fabulous. It excited me. There was something in it I recognized. I think, as you will understand, possibly because I was a Montessori teacher for 7 years, and Montessori taught us to observe very carefully. So that foundation was already there. But this work with the documentation of Reggio Emilia just took it so much further. It was very exciting. And I remember trying it. And and I was working with adults, of course. So the first panel, in those days we did these panels, right? First panel I did was very straightforward. I would say it was documentation as display. Here are my teacher candidates, my students doing a project approach, right? And that was easy, that one you could just put together. And then the next one, I was trying to understand how my teacher candidates' thinking had changed, how something, I had been talking with them about sharing something that altered their thinking. And this was radical for me to ask them to show this and to show it in a visual form. And what I got from that was so unexpected, so different from what I was expecting. Talk about pedagogical documentation. It just knocked me, the teacher, over, right?
So what was it that you got from that? What was it that had that effect on you?
I'll give you an example. The question I'd ask them was, what was the significant moment of learning for you during this year? And I'll show you this one young man. He ended up making, you see the Nike symbol?
Yes, yeah.
Right?
Very familiar.
And you think, well, what on earth's going on, right? Like he had trouble doing it visually, but when he told me the story, I just about fell over. He said, well, you see, it's the Nike symbol, and I had my shoes on and I was on the playground and a little boy ran up to me, he says, and put his shoe out and said, see, I've got the same shoes as you. And then he talked about how he realized this child had seen his shoes, gone home to his parents, and convinced them to buy him a pair. And not only that, but that this is what Nike, the company, meant to have happen through the branding with this.
Yes, swoosh. Yes.
So that, I mean, what had stunned the student was that just wearing these shoes has had this economic impact for a child's family, and he was in a very poor school. And what knocked me over was, oh my gosh, of course, I've never even thought of this kind of range of thinking as something that students are encountering when they're in a school. Like this was early in my work in a faculty of education, and I thought, wow, Carol Anne, you better open your mind up a little more.
Because the connections that children make in society when they're trying to make sense of the world, those connections are the really thought-provoking and interesting things to document. They get underneath the I don't want to say superficial, but the surface of what's immediately visible. They get underneath the surface to children's thinking or children's connections. So instead of just talking about, you and I have discussed this, trying to get past, just telling the story or past developmental domains to get into children's deeper thinking or their deeper connections. And that's the kind of journey that we seem to be on with pedagogical documentation.
I think it's it's the gift that it can give us if we're able to think past the surface. And we can't always, obviously, there's too much going on for educators in settings, but we can choose specific things to look at more intently, and we can slow ourselves down to consider those aspects in much more depth and precision and detail. And that's where I think we learn things we didn't see before. It changes us. And I mean, I think that's the power of pedagogical documentation, is its power to change the teacher.
Yeah, we think about all the time. We're thinking about the children. We're observing the children. We're thinking about what they're doing, what they're doing. We're trying to make sense of what they're doing. We're trying to find meaning. But we don't talk very much about the power to transform teaching, how it changes teachers. How do you think it's changed, or has it changed your work with adults, over the years? How has documentation influenced your work with adults? Do you think it's...
I think it helped me become much more creative. I think it helped me loosen up and not feel that, when you're working, especially given my work at York University, where I was working with school boards constantly, you can get pretty tight in those kinds of situations, right? And I think it really helped me be able to keep a deeper thread of caring and authenticity present, because once you've done that kind of documentation and it has had a sort of transformation, I don't like that word very much, but it has altered you in some way, you don't go back. You're changed, right? So you carry on, but in a different way. So I think it allowed me to trust the people I was teaching, whether it was children or adults, more, and to invite their creativity in ways I might not have if I hadn't had that alteration to my own thinking.
Yeah, so you and I, we talk a lot about this journey. Often, people start, when you mentioned that and I did the same thing, that we started with a simple display telling the story of what happened. And I in my experience in working with adults, I would say that the vast majority of people begin there. Certainly in my classes, when I'm working with adults, people begin there. And that's a fine place to start. And then you know, they might progress into trying to find deeper meaning and to uncover some children's thinking. And perhaps it gets to a point where it becomes more pedagogical in that we can learn from it. And I think you and I have talked about that final piece, making that leap is a big step, you know, to pedagogical documentation to produce things that we can learn from. What do you see as the biggest struggle in educators when they're trying to reach that level? I don't want to use the word stage; it wouldn't be appropriate. But to reach the point where the documentation becomes pedagogical, something from which we can learn. What's the biggest struggle? What's the biggest struggle?
I think the biggest struggle, possibly, it's my idea at the moment, is understanding the difference between a fact in the world and an idea we have in our head, and the fact that actually much of our thinking can be quite delusional in that it's not actually something that's there. It's an inference we make based on very limited information quite often, right?
Yeah.
And I think it's a huge thing for teachers to understand suddenly that they have an idea about a child, and then they see that the idea is wrong, right? That
Yeah.
really they were very limited. And when you have that sense that, oh, what I had in my head was not fact, it was just an idea, and you can see the difference between those, you become much more careful about what you say about children. I mean, I think a clear example is when, I don't know if it still happens, but when I was teaching high school, my first jobs, teachers would talk about students being lazy, right? And that used to puzzle me because I thought, no, they're not lazy, they're just not motivated. Whatever's happening isn't. I mean, both of those are ideas. They might or might not be the truth, but you would have to search, you'd have to do some research to figure out, right, whether what's going on. But I think teachers, and I use the word teachers because I'm thinking in this instance of schools, often get tied into very tight systems of thinking and use things like that as a way to disregard what's happening. But that's a different matter. I mean, documentation requires so much effort, so much work, and it's very tiring, right?
I think it's mentally,
Yes,
intellectually tiring. Yeah.
yes. So, I mean, I used to feel like it probably didn't suit all educators because it's too demanding.
I
But
think you have to be comfortable with disequilibrium to be able to go there, to have an idea, to create some documentation around it, but to be, as you mentioned, to develop an idea around something, to be able to ask a question, to be curious about it, and to come up with some sort of theory about it in your own mind, some sort of idea. That often feels like a risk for many educators.
well, I think this is why I do connect it to increased creativity, right? Because you get people who then start generating a theory and they understand it as a theory. Maybe this is what's going on. Maybe this is what the child's thinking. I realize it might not be. It's a possibility.
Yeah.
And then as soon as you're at that point, you can look at a much broader range of
Yes.
ideas, right?
You have to be prepared to be wrong and to be okay with that because you're thinking about it. You might be in dialogue with your peers. You might be puzzled by it. Like, for me, this is brought attention to the fact that we need to be curious and to be able to create questions around what we're seeing. Because if you create a question rather than a theory, you're putting yourself in the role of researcher. You're prepared to sort of have a go and follow this lead and see where it takes you. That is a state of disequilibrium, and it does feel risky, but it can lead to incredible things.
Yes, and there's an interesting aspect when you speak about having a question, because I think before we have a question, we have a feeling.
Mhm.
And we get a feeling around something, and that makes us want to do something with it, right? It's a kind of energy. It's like a seed that can grow, and that then gets somehow connected. It fuels our thinking. The feeling, I think, is a kind of fuel. And that I think we have to be really careful not to omit the role of feelings from how we get to interesting thinking. I'm going back to Damasio's book then, Descartes' Error, from many years ago, 1994, where he said we can't reason at all without feeling being part of it.
The feeling drives us, when you have feelings about something, when it matters to you, it drives you. It drives you. It motivates. And then, documentation is a lot of work, and we recognize that. And there's very little time for it in most institutions, whether it's a school or whether it's an early childhood setting. There's very little time that's given to the educator for it. But the motivation, often for myself, and I've seen this in student educators as well, is the passion of the idea, either the passion of the question. I saw this thing and I don't understand it, and it makes me really curious. I don't know what's happening, and it's raising all these questions. And so my response to that would be, well, good. I'm glad it creates questions, because we can start from there. We can start from questions. Interestingly, we're both very influenced by the practices in Reggio Emilia. Of course, there they talk about everything being a relationship. Everything is relational. And I've noticed that their documentation, the title of their documentation is often a question.
Yes.
And I find that very interesting. And I think it's a place for when educators are on this journey, it's a place for them to, often titles don't come to us until the end of the piece, when we're finished documenting it, then the title comes. But it's very interesting. I think it opens things up when you can use a question as a title. It sort of drives the documentation.
I liked so much the fact that the Ontario Ministry of Education, when they were redoing their frameworks, and they put the new framework out in 2014, they used a question, right? How does
learning happen? Yeah. Yeah.
And that was a real change
Yes.
in their whole approach to thinking about frameworks, right? To ask it as a question.
That in itself, that title, puts the whole framework in a different light. It's rather than being a sort of what's the expression I'm looking for? Rather than being sort of a formal government document, it sounds more inquiry based, that we are going to think together with this framework, we're going to think about how learning happens, because that's the question.
It's less authoritative.
Yes.
Which is what you might expect from a ministry.
Yes.
And that signals a whole change in thinking, right? The tenor of thinking. And it's also much more inclusive. The idea that anyone participating can offer what it might mean, right? And how it might happen.
And that's going to be different in every culture, in every area of the country, in every different institution. The way that we document and what we choose to document is going to be completely different. Pedagogical documentation is inclusive just because of the people who are in relationship with each other in that particular place at that particular time. Hopefully, it reflects that comes up in the documentation. People have done, Kathy Balsma has done some really interesting work on within pedagogical documentation of a sense of place, a sense of where we are within the documentation. And
Do you mean
that's
within a, do you mean the documentation itself as a place?
the
Or the
area where the land on which it takes place.
oh, okay. All right.
The geographical area. She tries to create, amongst other things, a sense of place, a sense of where the children are, how they're living on the land, that type of thing. And that appears in her documentation along with questions, questions for herself, as well as, questions that the children were asking.
There's a very interesting aspect to that because in the work of an anthropologist named Keith Bassel, what he learned, this was about the Navajo and other groups in the American Southwest, was that some of those groups, the land was extremely important as the vehicle for holding the culture's morality. They would go past a hill and say, oh, that's the hill where such and such happened. And they would have a story which went with that place. And when the people moved away from their area, someone went to Los Angeles, for instance, and they said they no longer knew how to live well because they didn't have these references in their landscape, which told them the meaning of how they should be behaving. It was fascinating. And when you think of cultures of the book, right, Christians with the Bible, the Jewish people, the Muslims with the Quran, the morality is held in the book, right? And that was very different from oral cultures. I think the Australian Aborigines were the same as having it very deeply embedded in landscape. So it's interesting when you think of the documentation we do with teachers, does it hold this kind of sense of values of what we want to keep and expand as important in our work?
It becomes very complex when you think about that. What are the values that we want to keep and make visible? What are the important and interesting things we think are happening for children, and taking a sort of a stab at that, trying to think around that. Then there are, then there is the teacher's voice, and I'm always encouraging people to insert their voice into the documentation. What are their questions? What are they bringing to the table? What do they want to include about themselves? That makes it a very complex piece, but so much to think about. And I think it's very layered, and people have different, of course, different levels of comfort with that, inserting themselves into the documentation. Some people feel much more comfortable only writing about the children or only making the children's thinking visible. But I think if we want to communicate our values and the reasons why we do things, why do we do these particular things with children? If we want to communicate that to society as a whole, society tends to undervalue children. If we want to make children's thinking visible and important, I think we have to be able to articulate that in our documentation.
Absolutely. And when you speak about encouraging the documenter to add their voice, that's an interesting aspect, because part of what makes a person authentic, I think, as an educator, is that they're able to share their voice. And that voice, of course, comes out of the feelings that use, or the emotion, if you wish, that the teacher has in her relationship with the children and with the material that they're engaged with. And if that authenticity is there with a very strong sense of compassion, right? I think this is what I've noticed with teachers, that the more they do this kind of documentation, the more authentic they become, the more empathetic with children, and the more compassionate. It's like they're like one's spirit gets bigger when you're engaged in this kind of work. It's very interesting.
I'm going to write that down. I like that. The spirit gets
Mhm.
bigger.
Mhm.
That's
Well,
something for me to think about.
you
This
let me
spirit getting bigger.
yes, well, do you remember, you know, the Canadian painter Lauren Harris? He said this beautiful thing. It just, what I just said reminded me of it. How did he put it? He said, I'm trying to paint, I'm trying to work to get up there at the top of my spirit. I can't remember if he said spirit or soul, one or the other, there where the universe sings.
Oh, mm,
I thought, but it's true. The closer we get to being um, fully creative, we what arises out of that is tremendous joy,
yes.
tremendous sense of being alive and being real and satisfied with the work we're doing. And
Because,
documentation can do that.
because finding meaning in our work, finding deep meaning in our work, that can come through documentation. Sometimes when I remember my own practice with children and I'm watching educators at work, when I'm out there in the field with them, the number of things that they have to think about in the course of a day is mind-boggling, you know, the multitasking that goes on. And to be able to take the time to think deeply about even a couple of things that have happened during the day or to have some dialogue about those things, it's almost like a gift, you know, it's a gift to be able to have that time to think deeply. I used to do it when I was driving home in my car in traffic. I would have the time finally to go through the day and sort of think about special, meaningful to me and meaningful to children moments that I want to find out more about. And it's a real gift to find those moments. And I think it
Well,
keeps the
Susan, I
passion.
think that's why we felt that people, teachers especially, educators needed a special space for that.
Yes,
Remember when we did the emergent curriculum sessions Saturday
yes,
mornings,
yes.
just carving out a time when educators were going to have the opportunity to think really deeply about something they chose, right? And it helps to expand one's mind and spirit and sense of satisfaction with the work. But you've
I
got to have it carefully documented or there's nothing to think about,
It
right?
has to it has to be documented, whether it's rough, raw documentation in your own notebook or whether it's developed. You have to have something to work with to have those lovely conversations that sort of warm your heart and get you fired
Mhm.
up, you know, for the next week. To be able to talk about your work is so important. And so there's this intertwining of relations and feeling and note taking, the practical part of note taking, and then dialogue, all coming together to you know, intertwine and to produce this lovely piece of work that other people will find interesting. And I think we had a community of practice, the one you're referring to, where people would bring a piece of documentation and discuss it. And that's incredibly useful. And it doesn't matter how raw or how simple it is in appearance. Um, it's the thinking around it, the dialogue
Yeah,
around it that counts.
the documentation, in a sense, is placeholder for
Yes,
a lot of material that you then can think about, right?
yes.
Um, it's a way of holding all that you might not be able to remember, especially details about conversations and so on. We forget those things very quickly, and the documentation can hold that so that it doesn't get lost, and then we can
Mhm.
think more.
We can go
Yeah,
back and revisit it and enjoy it.
yeah.
So if we, you know, you and I have talked about, both of us have worked with adults for some years around documentation, whether it's in a university setting or whether it's in, you know, workshops and seminars and these types of things. Um, so how have you, when you're working with adults, how have you helped them to sort of move along this journey to sort of deepen, deepen their practice? What kinds of things do you think are useful for them to develop as documenters?
I think one of the first things that I have done is to almost demand that they slow down to see what's there in the
Yeah.
documentation first. And sometimes I would do an exercise that would drive people just about batty because you'd spend an hour looking at something to know everything that's there. And what people would find when they did that, well, there were several things. One was that they would notice things they had not seen initially. Always that happened. Another thing that happened was they would see that other people saw things that they didn't see.
Mhm.
The value of having more than one viewpoint would become apparent.
Yeah.
And they would see that even though certain things had been mentioned, other people mentioned them again as if the first time it hadn't registered. Very interesting. And so that's one exercise I would do to make present some of these other qualities in us, which affect how we look at something like documentation. And those kinds of realizations, again, would help people slow down, help them ask more questions, and also surprised people quite often. And I found that would work well as a setup. You see, what I really think has to happen is we have to change our mental set when we're engaging with documentation in this way that's really thoughtful. We have to get out of our left brain tendency to label things very fast and move on.
Yeah.
Right? It's almost like a right brain capability of slowing down, like you do when you're drawing, right? You know how if you're or in music, you get into another mental state, and I think it's connected to that. We're still working with language. Oh, can you hear the helicopter?
Yes.
It's going to the hospital.
That's okay.
But you really, in this slowing down and becoming more aware of things that we usually just pass over, it's like a bigger landscape in which to think.
It's like peeling back a layer. Layer is layer by layer, just slowing down to peel back and see what else. And I totally agree about, the slowing down to hear others, making space for others' opinions and perspectives, which might be completely new to us, a completely new way of thinking, but so important to hear that. Most people these days work in teams, in the early childhood field, work in teams. And I think, it saddens me when I see that one thing that is missing in the whole pedagogical documentation development piece when people are on this journey is that they are not given time. Their directors or administrators don't have the luxury of the money to give them time to have dialogue with each other. And I think that dialogue is so important for all sorts of reasons, including pedagogy, developing documentation. The dialogue is where sometimes the magic happens.
You're saying that reminds me of what happened when Francesca came from Reggio Emilia to work at Bishop Strawn in Toronto. This was years ago. But she just said it was the kindergarten class she was working with. And she said to them, you're not working together. And they said, what do you mean? We're working together all day. And she said, no, in the morning one of you is going and setting up snack and the other one is doing this and that. And you're not sitting together and talking about what the children are doing and what you are going to do today in response, right? And so she just challenged them to stop the other stuff they were doing and sit down for 20 minutes and make the space. And the funny thing is, we all have the same amount of time, right? We have the time in the day that we're living. The Reggio educators have that same amount of time. We have that same amount of time. So it's how we use it. And it was just so interesting the way she just demanded that they see that they were not, in fact, talking together. And she worked with the administration to try to create time, and they had it for a while, then it got taken away again. You know, one of them had to go and be on the playground or something.
Yes, yeah.
But
routines tend to,
yeah,
and ratios and all of the legalities tend to take over, and the time gets chipped away. And we have in this province some very well-meaning, clever directors who have, just a handful, you know, who have carved out time, and they see the value of it, and they see the effect of being able to have dialogue for their teams, and they value it, and so they protect it.
do you have any
It's so hard. It's so hard for them to protect that time. It's really
Susan,
hard.
do you have any sense of how much time they're able to give them?
Not very much. Some people work very cleverly with, let's say they have an after-school program. Those after-school teachers, those two after-school teachers are actually retained full-time to give the staff planning time together. This is in a big center, huge center, to give the staff a little, like an hour a week to sit together and talk about what's been happening that week. Other centers don't have after-school programs. They can't use their budget that way, and they use their staff meetings. To talk about things other than the mundane, the daily logistics. They don't do that in their staff meetings, or not very much of it. They use their staff meetings for dialogue. And that's something that most of us can manage to do. Yeah.
Right. It may be the case that it doesn't even take so very much time to create the effect that we're thinking of, because I'm thinking if people slow down and create this kind of space or mental attitude, it also creates a lot of bonding.
Yes.
With the group, right? Yeah. And a shared memory. And it's a kind of fusional connection that works in many directions. You have the bonding with the group, you've got the bonding with the material, which creates a bonding with children. And, you get all of this happening, and I think it helps keep educators motivated.
Absolutely. I find with the childcare centres that I've worked with in the past, those that have the time to be with their team and to have conversations and who document and who talk about that documentation together, they tend to be very passionate about their work, and they stay longer with that setting because they value that time so much, and it's such a difficult thing to get. But as you say, pedagogical documentation, when we have it together, when we've created a piece, it's a holding place. It's almost like it's a holding place for us to revisit, as almost like an archive of our own thinking and our own growth, but also the children's thinking and their growth. So important to revisit it and to see where we've been and how much we've moved on from there. Really valuable tool.
Yes. I remember this project was so long ago, but I remember this was at Peter Green Hall, and Bobby Lynn Keating and I was going in, I don't know if it was once a week. It was when I was on sabbatical and I was home. It was the sculpture project.
Yes.
Yes.
It's in one of your books, yeah?
Yes. And it was 6 months later, when we looked back over all the documentation, that we saw what had happened. Right? We wouldn't, if we had not had the documentation and not reviewed it, we would not have understood the change that occurred, because what happened was this is just one thing. There were little boys, they were 4, and at the beginning of it, they couldn't draw with very much ease. And, they complained about their drawing, it bothered them. And at the end of this project, suddenly they were drawing fluid penguins. I mean, incredible looking. And you think, how on earth did that happen? And of course, as we reviewed all this documentation, we realized it was through all this three-dimensional work, working with three-dimensional forms. And then, you know, what blew me away, I read some art educators' comment from, this was years later, and this was from the 1890s. And this artist said, if you want to improve your drawing, you do three-dimensional work.
Yeah, there you go. And they had done it.
Yeah, I
They
had
had
not.
done it. So yeah, it becomes a learning tool. I mean, it's so worth the effort when you think about all the uses of pedagogical documentation for dialogue, for bonding, for holding on to memories, for seeing where we've been and how far we've come and how our thinking has changed. It's such a learning tool for all of us, including children. I love to see children go back to documentation because they've always got something to say. You know, they've always, you know, they'll go back and they'll say, I used to think this, but that wasn't right. Now I think this, you know, because they'll, like a 4-year-old will say something like, because I was little then and I didn't know, you know, and so they recognize their own movement, you know, their own thinking changing. It's so interesting on so many different levels.
Yes.
I don't want to keep you too long, Carol Anne, because this is a gift to us. So thank you so much for doing this. And give it, as always, every time you and I have a conversation, I come away with something else to think about. So I've written lots of things down for myself to think about and to follow up in further conversations. So thank you for sharing your thinking.
Thank you for being interested in chatting with me. Very nice.
It's an honor. It's a privilege. Thank you so much.
All right. Take care. Bye.
Bye.